Since 1948, since the creation of Israel, the Golan Heights has been the front line for the two most implacable enemies in the Middle East, Syria and Israel. The Israelis first conquered the heights in 1967. The Syrians won it back briefly in 1973. Today it's under the control of the Israelis, perched high on the mountain range that dominates the Golan. Thousands died in those two wars. Thousands more were made refugees, trapped on one side or the other. And today, as ever, the Golan lies at the heart of a conflict that's never been resolved. A conflict which, according to both Washington and Moscow, threatens another war in the Middle East. The Israelis, dug in along a 20-mile front, insist this is no longer occupied land, but part of Israel. The Syrians, just a few hundred yards away, maintain the Golan must be returned to them. For as long as anyone can remember, the superpowers have stood behind the two sides to this conflict. The Russians with the Syrians, the Americans on the other side with the Israelis. Both the Kremlin and the White House see the danger. Both acknowledge the threat. Now both want a solution. When the Golan comes up in discussion in Geneva next week, Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachov are going to find a good deal of common ground, because in the build-up to their summit, there have been significant moves on both sides. Israel, at Washington's behest, is letting it be known that it's ready to make territorial concessions here. Moscow, for its part, is suggesting something in return that both America and Israel would take as a major breakthrough, namely freedom for the many Soviet Jews who wish to leave Russia for the West. It's a complex jigsaw, typical of the Middle East and its crisis, yet the key question, as always, is whether the superpowers could deliver their surrogates to any agreement they might reach. Could Mr. Reagan, for example, make Israel live up to its word and give something back on the Golan Heights? And more pertinently, given Syria's total silence on the matter so far, could Mr. Gorbachov bring the Syrians to any negotiating table? For 15 years, Syria has been ruled by a man more fiercely independent than any other Arab leader. President Hafez al-Assad has confounded the predictions of both friends and enemies alike. In Lebanon, for example, where he humiliated the United States and the West. In Tripoli, where he almost destroyed Yasser Arafat's PLO. And in the Gulf War, where he's thrown his considerable support behind Iran. The politics of the maverick may be, but he's always been consistent on the wider issue of peace with Israel. President Assad has long since preached and practiced no compromise, without the return of the Golan Heights, and without a homeland for the Palestinians. And in standing firm for so long, Syria has become the symbol of the Arab cause and Arab pride.
Syria is an Arab country. Syria is defending the interests of the Arab world nowadays. We want our dignity back. We don't want to be always humiliated by the American policy and by the Israeli policy. We want our dignity, our pride.
To understand Syria is to understand a people and a government committed to war as long as there's no peace. Unlike the other countries that went to war with Israel in 1967, Egypt and Jordan, the Syrians are taught that any compromise will only threaten their own survival. So every child is a soldier of sorts from the age of 11. And every child is indoctrinated with a history and has the Arabs retreating on every front since 1948. Every front, that is, apart from the Syrian one. Syria, so the lesson goes, is fighting for peace. Only its strength will make Israel seek a solution. In a society that brooks little dissent, there's unanimity of opinion on this. It's not just because only one version of events is allowed. It's also Syria's experience.
Our people have learned from experience that they are facing not just an enemy, that is Israel. They are facing an enemy which is never satisfied, an enemy which is always looking for further land, further aggression, further expansion. And in the mind of that enemy also, there is the intention to humiliate the Arab side. Go back to the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, Beirut siege by the Israelis. What do you think the reaction of the Arab people? They have to be strong enough not to repeat the same nightmare. they wouldn't allow it. They are ready to sacrifice everything and not to see it happen again in Damascus, for instance.
Sacrifice is what the Syrian government has demanded of its people for the past 15 years. In that time, the country has undergone something of an economic and social revolution. What was a third world rural economy has become a Soviet-style exercise in collectivization. Virtually every piece of land has been expropriated by the government for huge state farms. If the aim was self-sufficiency, then it's worked, because Syria has long since shown that it's able to feed itself, and the dire poverty that was once the lot of the peasant here has been eradicated. As in the Soviet bloc, though, nationalization has led to inefficiency, overmanning, and a lack of aspiration among a people who were once the most successful merchants of the Middle East. The worker may enjoy the benefits of the cooperative, be it a creche for that rarity in the Arab world, the working mother, or the cooperative shop, everything at cost price. But the average wage is £35 a week, and with high inflation, that means little more than survival for most.
To take the essence of the problems that they're facing at present, they relate to a shortage of foreign exchange, a distortion of their budget by considerable expenditure on military matters and defense. Defense spending represents more than 70% of the total budget.
By the standards of the Middle East, let alone the world at large, that is a staggering commitment to the notion of war. The fact is that Syria has embarked on an unprecedented arms build-up. Its army stands at nearly 500,000, almost as big as Israel's when the Israelis are fully mobilized. From the Russians, it's bought hundreds of the latest T-72 tanks, and they're backed by the most sophisticated long-range missiles. So can this be anything but preparation for war?
It is a step forward for a genuine peace in the region. Because if the Israelis feel that another invasion of another Arab country would make them pay a heavy price, would make their existence in question, will put their existence in question, then they would go for peace.
Will you be ready to go for peace in that case as well?
Well, of course, of course.
There is then a certain pragmatism about Syria's thinking, a certain logic. Certainly there's a good deal more flexibility than the West sometimes acknowledges. In the past few months, it's been crystallized by President Assad's controversial relationship with Iran. Time was when there were carefully orchestrated demonstrations here in support of Ayatollah Khomeini and Iran in the Gulf War. It was always a marriage of convenience, though. And today, Syria has good reason to fear a fundamentalist revolution here at home. Not only does Syria have a Shiite Muslim minority of its own loyal to Khomeini, based here at a shrine outside Damascus, but just 3 years ago the government had to put down a violent insurrection by its own Muslim Brotherhood. The alliance with the Ayatollahs in Iran is no longer what it was. The Russians back Iraq in the Gulf War. A change of policy from Syria is what they want. And the prospect of that raises some hope in both Washington and Moscow, that given time, the Russians could make this country compromise on that wider issue, peace with Israel. Could you see Syria bending to the Soviet Union's will?
We believe that we speak with the Soviets and they speak with us on equal footing. They don't dictate to us their policy. In other words, what encouraged us to sign a treaty of friendship and cooperation is that their stand vis-à-vis the Arab-Israeli conflict is very much identical to our stand.
But could you ever see a time when Syria might have to compromise because of the Soviet Union's wish?
I can't see such thing is happening.
Are you one of those people who believes that only the superpowers can impose a solution in the Middle East?
Well, I think the superpowers can help, but they can't impose a decision on the peoples of the region.
It's 18 years since Israel went to war with Syria in the Golan Heights. 12 years since the Syrians tried to recapture the Golan, only to suffer another humiliating defeat and heavy loss of life. A generation has grown up since then, immersed in the politics of war. So too, in a sense, is Syria. When the superpowers talk next week, they may indeed find common ground on the Middle East. They may express a common hope for peace. They may reach tentative agreement on their next moves here. Yet the Russians, like the Americans before them, could yet be confounded by Syria's refusal to be a pawn on the diplomatic chessboard. And because down the years the Syrians have come to think the way the superpowers do, that to make peace, a country has to be ready for war. David Smith, ATN, Damascus. In the Middle East. The Israelis, dug in along a 20-mile front, insist this is no longer occupied land but part of Israel. The Syrians, just a few hundred yards away, maintain the Golan must be returned to them. For as long as anyone can... The Israelis first conquered the heights in 1967. The Syrians won it back briefly in 1973. Today it's under the control of the Israelis, perched high on the mountain range that dominates the Golan. Thousands died. Since 1948, since the creation of Israel, the Golan Heights has been the front line for the two most implacable enemies in the Middle East, Syria and Israel. In those two wars, thousands more were made refugees, trapped on one side or the other. And today, as ever, the Golan lies at the heart of a conflict that's never been resolved. A conflict which, according to both Washington and Moscow, threatens another war. Remember, the superpowers have stood behind the two sides to this conflict. The Russians with the Syrians, the Americans on the other side with the Israelis. Both the Kremlin and the White House see the danger, both acknowledge the threat.